Okay, so today we're in chapter 1 of Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes, and chapter 1 is called Serving Two Masters. Before we begin, I have a reflection question. I have an icebreaker question for you. If I invited you over for a big bowl of homemade chili, but I served it with steamed broccoli and side of soy sauce instead of cinnamon rolls, what would your thoughts be? So talk with people around you. How would that make you feel? What do you do with chili? Wow, you guys really have a lot of opinions about this. I know. Okay. So you guys got to tell me, what were you chatting about? So what do you put with chili? Do you do cinnamon rolls? Who does cinnamon rolls? Is that a Kansas thing? No. Okay. You don't know why? It's just yeah, it's just a thing. So who does not put cinnamon rolls with chili? Oh, what do you do? What do you do? No, really. Crackers, okay. Cornbread, Fritos. Oh, Fritos. Oh, yeah. So, okay, so I grew up in Topeka and got to smell the Frito-Lay factory, so we don't put Fritos on chili. But I grew up, my mom was a baker at our elementary school, and every time she'd make all those homemade cinnamon rolls every time we had chili at school. And so we just thought it was a Topeka thing, but I came down here and people do it. Oklahomans do it. Nebraska. Runza does it. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so it's a regional thing. So what is it about chili and cinnamon rolls, or say your favorite food pairing? Well, why do we have that regionally? Well, that introduces what we're talking about in this chapter about mores. Now, last week you asked me how to pronounce it, and I was like, well, I think it's like mores, but I'm not French, so we're saying mores. Last week was the psychology class, right? We did some optical illusions last week, talked about how our brain operates. This week is a little more about sociology and how people decide what norms are accepted. So you've heard of cultural norms before, things that everyone agrees are okay, or things that people agree are not okay in a group or a society. And so up on the screen, there are 4 different types of social norms that we have in any given society. The first one is a folk way. Now, this is more like saying please or thank you. It's being polite. So a folk way is a norm that stems from and organizes casual interaction. So these are routine casual interactions, and breaking them makes you look awkward or eccentric, right? If you borrow someone's car and you don't say thank you, I mean, you're not going to jail for that, right? But you might pause and be like, why didn't they say thank you? That's what we do, right? Another example would be wearing a tuxedo to a backyard barbecue. I mean, that's a little eccentric. We don't normally do that. Or eating pizza with a spoon. We don't do that either, really. But some people might. So people might stare or chuckle, but they won't stop being your friend if you're a little awkward or eccentric, right? Now, we have mores next. These are more than folkways. These are the morals. So a more is a norm that structures the difference between right and wrong. And that's actually what our chapter is about today. So these are norms that are widely observed as having what we call great moral significance. So this is right versus wrong. So when someone stands by while someone else is bullied, that's wrong, right? We all know that. In the Bible, failing to wash a guest's feet, right? That was wrong. Or talking back to an elder. Okay, so people feel righteous anger or indignation or genuine shock when these mores are broken, right? This is the right versus wrong. And then we have taboos. These are the unthinkables, all right? So These are mores that are so strong, the very thought of violating them is revolting. So I'll pick on Stacy. When we visited them in Japan, we learned very quickly that you don't blow your nose in public. That is taboo. You don't do it. What about cannibalism? How about incest? Those are taboos, right? Now, one of them you might go to jail, the other you might not, but they're both taboos. And from that, you get total social ostracization, right? You're kicked out of the group if that happens. Another one is laws. Now, these are official codified norms, and they are so important that the government writes them down. And they attach a specific physical or financial penalty for breaking these, right? Speeding. Speeding can kill. These four explain the unspoken rules generally of how a society operates. And in the chapter, in the beginning of the chapter, I actually disagree a little bit with the authors on page 30. Is it 30? No, page 29, the first part of the chapter, because they say that Webster's dictionary defines mores as folkways of central importance accepted without question and embodying the fundamental moral views of a group. Now, some folkways can be mores, but I'm showing you the four distinct ones because sometimes there's overlap, but mores are really a category unto themselves. They're not just folkways, like being polite. In the Bible, a lot of times what we read today as a folkway was actually a more for them. It was a matter of right and wrong. It was a matter of honor or shame. But we today sometimes read it as just being polite. So we'll see what some of those differences are as we go through the chapter. So page 31, they introduce mores with a couple examples. So page 31, in the South, a generation ago, many folks considered playing cards to be of the devil. You guys, I'm showing a picture of a bridge tournament at a church. What's the difference? So geography plays a role, like with chili and cinnamon rolls, geography plays a role in what's socially acceptable versus not, right? Especially at church. And the generation gap also can change what's acceptable versus not. And they give the example of drinking alcohol, right? How it used to, everyone had to be a teetotaler. But there are some places, like I have some Lutheran friends, they follow in the path of Martin Luther and brew their own beer. And they're very proud of that because Martin Luther did it, right? So it depends on where you are and what generation you're part of. I love the example on page 32 where they say, that was a good dog. This is my dog, Zoe. She herds cows. She's pretty fierce. She's an Australian miniature shepherd. And yeah, so the Australians would say she's one that herds sheep. I say she's one that doesn't chew shoes. But the authors say Amin Hassan would say that one that tastes delicious. How do we feel about that? Yeah, we feel pretty wrong about that, don't we? That feeling you get like, I will not eat Fido. That is a more. That's a social more. We've decided in our society that that is taboo. We will not eat Fido, right? But in some cultures in Asia, that's what they have. Unless you want to eat the rat that they talked about in the other part of the chapter, right? Now, to us, that sounds horrible, but to them, that's a delicacy. Isn't that interesting how different groups can make different rules for themselves about what's socially acceptable? They really talk about serving two masters and how we run into problems when our Christian values don't match up with our Western values, right? There can be a clash there sometimes. And in the late 1700s, early 1800s, we have the Great Awakening happening in England and here in America. And what's interesting is that the theater used to stand for all things immoral. right? Think of burlesque, right? And what's interesting is that George Whitefield was a famous preacher. He was probably the most popular American during the Revolution. More people heard of him than anyone else, which is really cool. He took on the role of an actor as he delivered his sermons. He was so fiery and so passionate. There's some really great writings about him and how he spoke at these revivals and won many people to Christ. What he was doing was breaking social mores of his time. He was acting like an actor. And you didn't do that because they were immoral. You can see this cultural shift happening to the point where church buildings were even designed to look like theaters. It's interesting how we compromise. And we totally did that with the theater. And on page 33, he talks about Westerners are tempted to compromise because we tend to view the world dualistically. That's the middle paragraph. Things are true or false, right or wrong, good or bad. We don't like ambiguity. We want it to be clear and straightforward. But we have to be careful because the authors point out that we're sometimes tempted to believe that our mores originate from the Bible. They may not actually. They may generate from the people around us. So being able to see the difference is key, and that's what the authors are trying to help us see in this chapter. On the bottom of page 33, they talk about how there are different mores around alcohol among Christians. Some Christians say absolutely not, teetotaler all the way. But then you have my great-grandma. This is not her recipe. I couldn't find hers. I have it somewhere. So this is one I found on the internet. But cough syrup, anyone? It's still alcohol. You guys, there's alcohol in NyQuil. So again, where we live and who we're with dictates what's okay and what's not. So we have to be careful, is it right? Is it wrong? Is it good or is it bad? Because it could be in the gray area. This came from a doctor. It's okay. Maybe I shouldn't mention that doctors used to prescribe smoking cigarettes. I think it helps to compare the Middle Eastern context that the Bible was written in with ours. So, today we focus more on, is it legal, right? So that's the laws part of social norms. But in Middle Eastern culture, they focus on, is it honorable, right? They focus more on personal relationships. They focus more on the mores, whereas we focus more on the laws, which is really interesting because that can totally change how we read a passage of Scripture, such as Sodom and Gomorrah. Was that interesting to you to read? Yes, here on page 34 or 35, I love this painting. This is by Benjamin West from 1810. It's Lot fleeing Sodom. Now, on page 34, they talk about how, because mores aren't universal, we may not be aware that these different gut level reactions can affect how we read the Bible. So that's where we get to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. So when the angels come to Lot in Sodom, what does he do? He invites them in. Yes, he entertains them. He gives them a place to stay. He is upholding the ancient sacred duty of hospitality. Like, to them, it was a sacred duty to keep someone. Think about in the wilderness or in the desert, they had a rule that any guest could stay for 3 days. And the idea was you're saving them from death, right? You're providing for their needs. This is a sacred duty. And so Lot is doing that, which is a direct contrast to the rest of the people who live in the town who have extreme inhospitality and violent wickedness, right? We tend to think that there's only one sin happening there. There's actually multiple, right? It's not just the sexual violence there. It's the inhospitality. We get a good view of that from Ezekiel, interestingly. So Ezekiel says, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. So it's not just the sexual sin. in that culture, they were breaking the moray of hospitality. That's something interesting that they point out here is we tend to miss that. In our culture, we tend to focus more on the sexual sin, which is still very much present and a problem, even in that culture at that time. Additional sin that we miss, they're not being hospitable. The authors then say that they want to consider 3 issues that are surrounded by cultural mores. Sex is just one of them, but then food and money are the other examples. So we'll take one at a time. So the next section is about the Apostle Thomas and his missionary expedition to India. So he goes to India, and we read about this in documents that are outside of the Bible. There actually is a Gospel of Thomas. Has anyone heard of that? It's a separate, it's a separate document. It's correct, yes. And so we do not consider it part of our canon. There is a lot of doubt, ironically, about this document. It does. It does. Totally, yes. But what we can glean from it is that Thomas went to India, and there are multiple documents, ancient sources that talk about Thomas making a trip to India, and he was actually martyred in Chennai, India. So this painting is from Peter Paul Rubens in like 1637, 1638, and I love this painting. There's a lot of detail. I know it's a little far away. I'll zoom in. Don't you love the cherubs and their little tiny bottoms? Oh, you gotta love painters. Okay. So he was martyred apparently on July 3rd, 72 CE. So this is right after the destruction of Jerusalem and before Vesuvius erupted and covered Pompeii. So like right in between there. And so Thomas goes to India, and the authors recount this story of Thomas going to a wedding and preaching abstinence. How does that go? Well, in India, because back then they had lots of what we call asceticism and celibacy, they welcomed that message. But what's the problem with the message that Thomas was allegedly preaching here? Let's go to 1 Corinthians 7, shall we? Yes, Thomas was allegedly preaching celibacy was the only or the best way. But I think he might have skipped over a couple other parts of 1 Corinthians 7. Yes, let's read verse 6. Who's got that? Okay, thank you. Yeah, so in verse 7, Paul literally says, I say this as a concession, not as a command. I think Thomas missed that part, maybe. Okay. Now, back in verse 1, he says, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And so he takes that to the extreme. But then what about verse 32 to 35? Don't get married. What a hassle, and it takes you away from God. But what is our usual counter to that verse? What do we say here in America? We tend to focus on what? We focus a lot on marriage here, don't we? Going back to Genesis 2:24, right? A man shall leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife. Yeah. Okay, so now what do we do? Are these in disagreement? No. Ephesians 5:31 reminds us that this is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh, right? So how do we handle this? How do we reconcile this? What do they say in the chapter? Like, why is Paul advocating for celibacy at that time? They talk about it on page 38. Absolutely, yes. And Paul actually does argue for both sides. But what happened to Thomas? He forgot one side. Yeah, he got really hyper-focused on one side, didn't he? the thing is, so we've been talking about, Middle Eastern areas, so we call that the ancient Near East. If you go further east into India, China, back then, celibacy and singleness was celebrated. That's why Thomas honed in on that message to win converts. But in Western society, we take Genesis 2:24 very seriously, and we multiply, right? Marriage is preferable to singleness in our culture. But what the authors point out is, I think on page 40, the second paragraph, because we privilege marriage as God's preferred way of life for everyone, churches in America, on the whole, do a very poor job of ministering to single adults. I see a lot of nodding of heads. We know this, right? Thank you for that. Yeah. So the comment is, we recognize it. We all nodded heads, but maybe we don't know what to do with that. Maybe we don't know how to bless that group of singles. What's interesting is the author brings up men who choose singleness. And what do we think of that in our society? So I have a story about this. So one of my cousins has wanted to be a preacher since he could talk. And he went to preaching school. He went to Bear Valley. He went through all of the training. He does very, very good lessons. Very good. He reads and speaks Hebrew and Greek. Like, I learned from him. And the hard part is he applied. So he actually went to law school, got a law degree, was a lawyer for a while, decided that wasn't for him. He really wanted to preach. And every church he interviewed at was very gracious, let him come in for an interview, but every single church, and there's more than 2 hands I can count on, that sent him a letter that said, you gave a fantastic lesson, you've got great doctrine, you're really good with people, you're not married. We're not hiring you because you're not married and you don't have children. And that was really hard for him. Yeah. So what's interesting about your comment about men in preaching school being advised to be married, what about all of the current scandals of married preachers having affairs? Is this a double standard? Right? Absolutely. So is it fair for us to prejudge singles and say, well, sorry, you can't be a preacher because you might have sin? I will tell him you said that. He will be delighted. I'll tell you after class. And all of that goes back to our social norms. We've all agreed through our society that in Western society, marriage is preferable. But that leaves out so many people. Good conversation. All right, let's switch to money. Everyone's favorite topic. Page 40. Recognize it, Kathy? Okay, so the section in chapter 1 on money. What's interesting is the authors point out the different view of money from the ancient Near East to the West. And that's on page 41. So Paul talks about in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, if a man will not work, he shall not eat. And we really take that to heart here, don't we? This understanding of wealth is the very opposite of how many non-Western churches view it. Outside the West, wealth is often viewed as a limited resource. There's only so much money to be had. So if one person has a lot, everyone else has less to divide among themselves. We don't feel that here so much. America is what you make it, right? The American dream. You can buy a house and have a car and have land. I wonder what my pioneer ancestors thought. They took a wagon train from Chicago down to Kansas before Kansas was a state, and they founded the town of Eudora. But you think about what it takes, for American pioneers to go out in the great unknown, take everything with them in a wagon that they needed to set up a town, and they did. Do you remember the steamboat Arabia in Kansas City? and how it was filled with everything a town needed. They were going to set up a town. So that's very much part of our ethos in America, at least, is, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and survival, and you don't need other people. You can do it yourself. And the hard part is when we read the Bible, that's not the ethos of the Bible, right? And it's especially true with money. So in the ancient Near East, they thought there's only so much money to be had, and we've all got to share it. And if someone has too much, that means someone else doesn't have enough. Remember the man who had a great harvest and decided to tear down his barns and build bigger barns? How'd that end up for him? Yeah. He did not make it because that violated their mores of how to handle money. What he should have done was what? Shared. Yes. Use it for good. Absolutely. And he didn't, and he was struck dead that night, right? On page 42 at the top, it says from the Psalm 52:7, the wicked person, we're told, piles up more wealth than he or she needs. The harsh words even Jesus said about the wealthy in Mark 10:25 and Luke 6:24. Let's have someone read those. But what do we do in America, right? The goal is you work hard until you save up, and then you retire, and then you can spend it all, right? But in the ancient world, that would have broken their norm. They would never have thought to do that, right? You share what you have now with others, so the whole community benefits. So it's a very different attitude in the Bible towards money. Now they get a little personal. They're talking about the women in the church. So what was interesting when Kathy and I got to go to Athens a couple summers ago, and the picture I have up on the screen is up by the Parthenon. So we had to climb this very, very large hill in Athens, and it's across the pathway from the Parthenon. This is called the Erechtheion, and these are the caryatids, and they're women. They're pillars holding up the roof, but they're carved in the shape of women. They have the most beautifully sculpted hair. It's actually a design feature to strengthen their necks. But that's what it looks like. And that's just one. Every one of them is different. And so when we went to the Parthenon Museum, they have a couple in there, and you can see how intricately carved. Some of them had fishtail braids. Some of them, you can see the braids circling the head. So we've got to talk about hairstyles in the ancient world when it comes to talking about money, because maybe not unlike today, it's a little different today, but back then, women would show their wealth through their hairstyle. So I've got some images here. On the left is an actress from the HBO TV series Rome. You've got a sculpture down below. Look at that tall hairdo. The image on the lower right is showing a woman. She's got a wax tablet and stylus. She's taking notes, so she already knows she's educated and wealthy. If you can see her head, it looks like she has a halo. That actually is the picture on the top right. That is like a 22 karat gold bun cover. It was fancy. And this is just a small sampling of the gold and the beads and the jewels that they would weave in their hairstyle. Now, I actually watched a video of a hairstylist, and she recreated some of these ancient hairdos. And it turns out they actually took needle and thread to sew it together. I mean, they didn't really have ancient hairspray. They did have ancient curling irons. And they also employed a slave to do their hair. And this particular slave was they only did hairstyles. It was a whole thing. And I mean, even men had adornments in their hair. Sometimes it was gold laurels. Sometimes it was pearls. Sometimes it was emeralds, garnets, other jewels, amethysts. but they were highly elaborate and it showed your status. So these were indicators of luxury. And also 1 Timothy 2, he talks about it on page 43, they mention that. What they're really talking about is not just modesty, it's economic modesty. You think about the makeup of the early church. It broke down those social barriers. And so in one church, say the church in Rome, you could have people from the very wealthy equestrian class, you could have slaves in the same church, you could have all different social classes and women all in the same church, which was totally unlike Roman society. So the church was defying the social norms by bringing everybody together, whereas in their real life, they would all be separated by class. And so when the wealthier Christians came to church, they kept their displays of wealth on. And that's what we're seeing here in Corinthians and in Timothy. They're admonishing women to dress economically modestly, right? Don't make everyone else feel bad. Like, we already know you're wealthy. You don't need to show. That's not how the church works. The church doesn't care about economic wealth, right? We're here for spiritual reasons. So that's what they're talking about, were the women with these elaborate hairstyles. And we saw statue after statue of these ridiculously tall and amazingly beautiful hairstyles while we were in Athens at the museum. Another topic of money, on page 44, they talk about in New England churches. I have stood in this one on screen. This is the Old North Church. Anyone know why this one's famous? Think back to the Revolution. Paul Revere. Yes, this is where he hung the lantern. Boston, the Old North Church. So we're headed there this summer. We're going to take Finn to go see it. Okay, so you see on the bottom, they're not just pews like what we have. They are boxes. This was a pay-to-pray system. This was a big deal. This is how you paid your tithes to the church. You could buy a box. But it wasn't just that. It was basically functioning as your own personal property. And it was cold. They didn't have central heat. And so what they would do is they would put little burners inside. You could put a burner inside your box and keep your feet warm while you're in church. People would bring their own possessions and put it in these boxes. And they like come up almost to shoulder level when you sit in it. It's like a little mini house. And so they would purchase and own their own box, and it would fund the church. But the problem was, as you can imagine, wealthy people would get the good seats. They charged more for the boxes in the middle, up toward the front. So these were high-walled, lockable pews that functioned as personal property, provided warmth, but again, they designated social status. And that was the problem. And so you would see the same social stratification from, Monday through Saturday, walk into the church building and nothing's different, right? In Christ, we're all supposed to be equal, but that wasn't really happening. And so, owning a pew in a church like this one was a status symbol, and it also granted the owner a vote in church business. So the more wealthy you are, the more you get to have a say in what happens, which obviously excludes people who weren't wealthy. So those who could not afford to buy a pew were relegated to free, less desirable seating. They got the cheap seats. Yes. The red box? Oh, that is a great question. I don't recall what that is. I'd have to read it. But yeah, you can see. And so that's what church was like in New England in the 1800s. Up until 1912, they operated like this in this pay-to-pray system. Now, why does that make us cringe? Yes. That's right. Yes, in the book of James, show no partiality. And yet that's exactly what happened here. Again, that's what their social norm was. So I think you're starting to see, how mores can, when Western values collide with Christian values, right? This is what happens. All right, so let's move on to food, everyone's favorite more. We probably should have started with food. That seems to be the easiest one. Anyone recognize this scene from a movie? Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. What is she about to eat? Monkey brains. And immediately after, she passes out. This is what I thought of when I read this section, was Indiana Jones. So the authors, which author is this? Randy recounts a time in an Indonesian spot where he brings in some American visitors, and it's a potluck. Oh, sometimes we cringe at potlucks here, but imagine when your best option is dog meat. Page 45. I feel bad for that student. On another occasion, he says he chose not to tell them the main dish was stir-fried rat meat and mentioned it later that evening, and the student ran outside to throw up a meal that had been digested hours earlier. Why? Why would she feel that way? Why do we feel that way reading about stir-fried rat? Ooh, raw goat liver. Oh, so that's tricky because you don't want to offend your host. But our Western mores are like, nope. The authors say, or Randy says, as these illustrations suggest, biologically edible is a much broader category than culturally edible. What about making cheese? They talk about it on page 46. Our Asian friends are appalled by cheese. Anyone like blue cheese? Have you seen how it's made? Some things are better left unseen. Okay. Oh my. Now, they tie this to Peter in Acts chapter 10, right? Remember the big sheet coming down with all the animals? Why would Peter be nauseated? Yeah, they were all unclean, and God is saying, kill and eat. I'm changing the rules. Is it easy for us to switch our mores that quickly? No. Over time, maybe. And he points out how, like we do, the ancients transferred their feelings about certain food onto the people who ate them. The very idea of a table mate gobbling down pig meat was enough to send a good Jew scurrying for the latrine. If that's the case, how did the church even get started? Have you thought about that? Right? It started off as a group of Jewish followers of Jesus, right? Early in the book of Acts. But, by Acts, chapter 8? Ish, they're called Christians in Antioch. We start bringing in Gentiles who do eat bacon. How did that work? Do you imagine they had some issues sharing a table at first? I think that's the author's point is, for some of these social mores, they're not necessarily from the Bible, right? And so we've got to be able to see the difference and not let it divide us. So to end, we're on page 48. The authors say, what we want you to see is what goes without being said for us concerning mores can cause us to misread the Bible. So if we're not paying attention, our expectations, our social mores can cause us to misread the Bible. So they give us multiple options to help us watch out for these. So the first one is begin with yourself. Start paying attention to your instinctive interpretations as you read biblical passages that have to do with values, right? Have my presuppositions blinded me to other sins the text might be highlighting? So the whole Sodom issue about hospitality that we might have overlooked. Second, on the bottom of 48, look for clues in the text you're reading. So they give the example of Luke 6, 1-9, where Sabbath is mentioned multiple times. That's a clue. It's important, right? So it's talking not about eating or healing, but Sabbath mores. And finally, on page 49, the second paragraph, the best way to become sensitive to our own presuppositions about cultural mores, what goes without being said for us, is to read the writing of Christians from different cultures and ages. So I actually have a quote from C.S. Lewis, and it's one that they mentioned in the book. So it says, it is a good rule after reading a new book never to allow yourself another new one until you have read an old one in between. So a 1-to-1 ratio, okay? If that's too much for you, you should at least read one old to every 3 new ones. Now, he's not just talking about, any kind of book. He's talking about the greats, right? The classics. He argued that old books provide a clean sea breeze of perspective that corrects the specific, often hidden mistakes of contemporary thought. And so that also helps us to think about mores that are hidden, right? The things we don't talk about that are in the text, but we might miss. So our ultimate goal should be to live the Christian life more faithfully. We need to be aware of our mores because they can contradict Christian values, okay? So we've seen a lot of places where that happens in today's reading. Okay, so final closing question here. How do you think differently about specific cultural mores than your grandparents? So think about it, share with your neighbor. Ready, set, go. So wasn't this eye-opening? Oh man, so next chapter will be the Bible in color, race and ethnicity. So this will be very interesting. So read that for next week, and we'll come back with some more fun questions.